Hey there, friendos, Newbornkilik here, welcoming you to the Legend of Zelda enemy tier list. And this is actually a video I've wanted to make for a while. Admittedly, I was going to put it in a top 10 format, but since we have tier lists trending, why don't we just go ahead and knock out two of those birds with one stone? So, just as a heads up, we will be ranking each of these enemies as far as a couple different things. Overall design, how challenging they are, could also be a certain thing. And then, a couple of them, some special characteristics / stories that I may personally have with them. So, the tier list may be just a tiny bit biased, but I'm sure if you've seen the top tier list, then you'll know exactly where those are going. Place your bets for S tier enemies now, and if you happen to get at least one of them right, leave a comment with the hashtag Zelda, just so that I know that you're an extra cool person. Number one, I'm not going to do all these in order, but I'm going to do number one. First off, we have the big Deku Baba. Now, very, very standard kind of enemy, really. And, I have to say, overall, not very impressive, but definitely a step up over the standard Deku Baba. Can't move, so that does, might knock it down a tier. Overall, not very challenging, but very good and useful for gathering resources, especially the Deku Nuts and Deku Sticks, which Deku Nuts I had no idea were as important as they were until this latest randomizer playthrough. So I'm going to go ahead and place them in B tier, right smack dab in the middle, basically. So we're not going in order, as I said. Now we have the Ice Keys. Alright, so these bad boys, the Ice Keys, okay. Let me tell you something about the Ice Keys. The Ice Keys are annoying. Okay? Frustrating to deal with, but not terribly difficult. Now, they freeze you. So on top of doing damage to you when they hit you like a standard Keys would, they also freeze you, which is annoying. So that's going to knock them down a little bit. However, they do a bit more damage. They come sliding in. They're never really in a place where it doesn't make sense for them to be, so that is a plus, I suppose. But based just off of the frustration and whatnot, I'm going to have to put them into the C tier, partially just because it's a straight buff from a Keys, so there is that. Anyway, now we will pick up the Gwai, I believe is what these things are called, the birds. Okay, everyone just calls them the birds, but I believe they're called Gwai. Now the Gwai are basically just Keys. That's basically it. As such, they can't have an element that I know of. I've never seen them with an element. Usually, if, they're in a place where they can get an element, they're probably going to be a Keys anyway. So these are basically just a downgrade from a fire or an ice Keys. So that's just, D tier. Bam. For those reasons, putting it in the D tier. Let's grab something a little spookier now. All right, now we have an enemy. All right. Okay, so now we have the big Skull Chola. All right. Now, tell me that when you see realistic art of these bad boys, you do not pee your pants, alright? If you said you didn't, you're lying to me, and I'm upset with you on a genuine level. So, that makes me want to put it in the tier, but they're not challenging. Even as a child, they're pretty easy to deal with. So, I would say, as far as enemies, I'm gonna have to put them in A tier for the spook factor, because they are absolutely terrifying. And real-life renditions of these bad boys are not good, not fun at all. So, now, let's move on to... what are these things even called? Spike. Any of you actually know that? Very kind of an interesting enemy, and there is a bit of... I always found it kind of creepy. One, they're only in the water temple, which is, at least that I remember, they're only in the water temple. But they actually have red and blue bubbles that pop out of them, indicating that they do bleed. This is very uncomfortable to me, and I was thinking, they're not very exciting enemies. They're pretty boring, to be completely honest, and they're the water temple, so that may even bump them down even more. They're relatively uncommon, which may actually help to their strengths, in my opinion, but overall, they're a relatively boring enemy. With very, very niche appearances. I mean, they can be on land, but they're really not. They're definitely mostly in the water temple. So for those reasons, the fact that they are relatively interesting, as they do seem to bleed and are alive, by that logic, I would assume anyway, I'm going to put them in the C tier, of a very solid mid-tier, more so interesting than anything, not really a threat. All right, likes. Okay, let me tell you something about likes. I actually have a story about like-likes, which is going to bump them up on the tier list, and when it comes to iconic Zelda enemies, a like-like is definitely among them. And if you're not careful, they are the only enemies in the game that, well, one of the few enemies in the game that can actually strip you of your equipment. However, with the fire keys, you know, they can take away your wooden shield. That's really the only thing you're going to lose to a fire keys. However, these bad boys can take most of your extra equipment, your tunics, your shields, and there is a chance that you will never get them back, assuming you don't know how to take care of them. You know, say they suck you up, you know, you're not thinking about it, you don't see the dialogue prompt that he just took your stuff, and you just forget where your shield went. That's just a shield that's gone now. You have to go and replace that shield, assuming you didn't go back and get him. So as far as iconic Zelda enemies go, you know, I gotta put the like in the S tier. He's a very unique enemy. It's they're gross, let's be totally honest. They do actually have armor on their sucky spouts, so they do have some form of defense, which is pretty interesting. Into the S tier with you, my boy. Well, since we're talking about gross organic material style enemies, let's talk about the Parasitic Tentacle. Parasitic Tentacle, of course, is found in Lord Jabu's belly. Now, this enemy could be challenging if you didn't know how to deal with them. They're one of the few enemies that the boomerang actually damages, which I find rather interesting. And logically, I don't know why it's in the place that it is. It is technically a common enemy. It's not a mini-boss, so by that logic, if it's not a boss or a mini-boss, it's on this list. My problem with it is that once you know how to defeat it, I guess with any Zelda enemy, it's actually very, very simple, but it's meh. Sorry, my boy, you're not going in that. I'm gonna have to put you in F tier. Just cause, it's literally just a giant sausage, and there are so many penis references that you have to make about it just to get through that fight, honestly. So uninspired in my opinion. Now, if this looked, let's pull up another enemy. If this had like a head or something on it that like looked like terrifying and stuff, which I'm guessing concept art did have something kind of like what we see here. May have been on that Parasitic Tentacle, that easily would have made that enemy much more interesting and easily bumped it up to a C tier in my opinion. Let's talk about this bad boy. This one is called a Tail Passerin. I learn something new each day, so get back here, young man. This is a Tail Passerin. I'm probably mispronouncing that name, and I will be reminded in the comments, of course. So you see this enemy one time throughout the entirety of Ocarina of Time, and its rarity is rather interesting to me. It's definitely a parasitic style of enemy, and I don't think they use that texture anywhere else. Like, they don't use that effect anywhere else to my knowledge, and that really actually does, in my opinion, kind of help out this enemy as far as being interesting. So, with that said, I'm gonna go ahead and slap it into, let's go B tier, based mostly off of being an interesting enemy. They actually do aggro onto you. They will attack you rather aggressively, although not quickly. And you just kind of have to deal with them, and before you get the boomerang, that can be a bit challenging. Since we're apparently in Jabu's belly, we're going to talk about this enemy, this bubble, or as the wiki calls it,
Jabu.
And I'm pretty sure Navi just calls it a bubble. I could be incorrect about that. Anyway, we'll know. Anywho's, it's what? Relatively annoying enemies, so I mean that's definitely going to hurt its placement here. Kind of uninspired, but it is just the tiniest bit interesting in that it doesn't necessarily attack you. It's not aggressive towards you. This is the style of enemy that literally only is impeding your movement forward, but not even on purpose. It's usually found in narrow corridors in Lord Jabu's belly. So, as far as kind of being a non-enemy and being pretty boring at that, and being annoying, it's going to be slapped into the F tier. Let's be honest. Since we're apparently inside Lord Jabu's belly at the moment, we're going to go talk about this jellyfish thing here. What is this thing called? A Beery, apparently, according to the wiki. So, Beery is just a jellyfish. It does have electrical properties, which is unique to it, so that's definitely gonna help it. I would say it's about C tier without the unique element, there aren't a lot of things in the game that have the electricity element. So, you know, it's pretty interesting in that it is an aggressive I need to stop that. What is wrong with me? Why is my ring finger so heavy? The Beery, or the jellyfish as I shall be referring to it from here on in, does have some unique elements. It's quite rare. I can only think of one place you actually find it. So, you know, off of the rarity, they're not terribly difficult to deal with, not terribly challenging, which I might actually say would lower its placement on the tier list. It is a rather easy enemy. It's a good kind of just way to keep you moving through the level, basically. They're not terribly annoying, however they can be in small corridors, so I'm going to slap it into a respectable mid-C tier. Continuing through Lord Jabu, we have whatever this monstrosity is. A Bari. Ooh, not a Beery, this is a Bari. However, infinitely more interesting. There is, I believe, one, perhaps two of these enemies in the entirety of Ocarina of Time. I can only remember seeing one. So just off of rarity alone, all of these other enemies, there's at least one or two of them, although they may be in very similar locations. I can only think of one Bari in the entire game, and that is rather impressive. Although I do think it's kind of interesting that this is called a Bari, because the name of the boss in that area is called Barinade. So I guess if you give this thing enough Gatorade and enough time to gestate, it will in fact turn into that. So maybe a little bit of a lore piece is that this is actually a Barinade, you know, not fully formed yet, in which case Lord Jabu is about to be in a whole lot of pain given how much damage Barinade was doing to that one section that he was in. So definitely an interesting enemy. It's not aggressive. It does have some unique, you know, aspects about it. You know, honestly, I might say I'm going to go ahead and throw it in A, but I reserve the right to change that later just because of, you know, the clever naming and the fact it just doesn't move. I think that's my biggest problem with it. The rarity is great. However, the fact that it doesn't move or attack you necessarily is kind of This could be a lot cooler, and you don't need a specific item to defeat it that I remember. So, challenge is relatively low. It's more of an ambush style enemy. Continuing through Lord Jabu, we have the Stinger. Now the Stinger is an enemy that's almost a non-enemy. It really doesn't bother you unless you bother it first, but it has some really weird beady eyes that I'm sure you can't see, but I saw a really close-up picture of one. They're pretty gross. And as far as enemy attack patterns go, it's relatively interesting. They're uncommon. They're not, you know, all over the place, like you might find a Keese all over the place. So that's definitely going to help it out a little bit. However, as far as things that they do, they're not terribly interesting. They really, all that they have going for them is the fact that they are hiding. You have to actually get them out of the dirt, or to Jabu in most cases. But then, you know, they do a bit of a loop and they attack you head on. So just kind of the extra animation time and their rarity is pretty neat. I'm going to go ahead and slap it into mid-C tier. Now, if these had electrical properties, they would be in B tier as well. So, just to tie up the loose ends that I've managed to leave here for myself, we have the standard Deku Baba. The Deku Baba is just a smaller version of the big Deku Baba. Very uninspired, just totally outdone by the larger version, in my opinion. So it's gonna lose a tier basically off of that. It still is one of the first enemies that you'll find in the game, so it's very nostalgic to a lot of people, or else it would probably be D tier. And then we have the Withered Deku Baba. Essentially, this is a Deku Baba that just stands up straight. It's pretty boring. However, again, it is one of the enemies that you will find first. In fact, this is probably the first enemy that you will face in all of Ocarina of Time, so it's very nostalgic. The nostalgia alone is going to keep it out of F tier and is a great place to farm on the randomizer for some Deku sticks, which can be invaluable. However, again, just a more boring version of the big Deku Baba, so it's getting slapped in the D tier. We have the Blue Bubble. Blue Bubble is less threatening in this game than it is in a lot of games. Now, it is interesting that it does have a two-stage factor. There aren't a lot of enemies that actually have two stages. There's the stage where, you know, the enemy has his fire and he's immune to a lot of attacks, specifically sword slices. However, they bash into you and you literally block them and then they're vulnerable. Their attack makes them vulnerable. Now, in some other games, they can jinx you and make it so that you can't use your sword, which would definitely shoot him up on the tier list, but in this game, relatively boring, to be completely honest with you. I want to say one other thing that I actually was unaware of for the longest time, and the reason that I'm going to put it into B tier is if you put a bomb down, they will actually circle around the bomb until it blows up and kills them. So an interesting little interaction, which will be moving him up to B tier. Next we have the blue Tektite, a stronger version of the standard Tektite. Again, a super nostalgic enemy, and once you get their patterns down, relatively simple to deal with, not terribly exciting. However, if you don't know the patterns, it can be a little bit challenging to get them unless you move around to the side. They're pretty creepy, honestly. Just that one big beady eye. They have the ability to essentially stride on water, which is, a unique thing. I think they're the only ones actually that can do that. So I'm thinking B tier at the moment. And not to mention for this and for the red Tektite, which should be coming up very shortly. If not, I'll grab it out of there. There's a little mini game that I like to play with the blue Tektite where you wait for them to jump to you and then try to get them on their arc. So if you miss, you take damage. If you get it, then you look like a cool guy, and it's pretty neat. So you can actually get to play that little minigame twice with the blue Tektite. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and move over to the red Tektite. In my knowledge, basically the same as the blue Tektite. You can still play that little minigame, however, just a little less, not as tough. A little bit easier to defeat. You do see them first, so they may be a bit more nostalgic. However, I'm going to place them in the C tier simply because they don't, as far as I know, have the ability to stride on water, and even if they do, they would never be in a position where they would have to. So, for all intents and purposes, I'm going to assume that they cannot, although realistically, game logic-wise, they're probably just a recolored blue, or the blue is a recolored red, and they probably have the same properties. But overall, weaker enemy, weaker position on the tier list. Business Scrub. Here we go. Now this is an enemy that I can really get behind. A two-faced dynamic enemy with a very, very interesting claws. This is the only enemy in the game where you can buy something from him. They always rip you off. All right, and the fact that they're always looking to rip you off, even though you basically have a knife to their throat, is gonna put them in A tier at the highest. I'm conflicted between A and S tier, just because they are a very unique enemy. But you can get some very, very worthwhile upgrades from them, so that might push them into the S tier. I'm going to go ahead and leave them in A tier for the simple reasons that they're cheapskates. They won't cut you a deal. However, they do give you hearts even after you buy some stuff, so that's pretty neat as well. Since we're talking about scrubs, I'm going to use the same logic as I did for the Tektites here. The Deku Scrubs are basically just business scrubs that retreat after you hit them. So with that in mind, they're a little bit less interesting. I do think it's kind of interesting that they have a special animation for actually becoming tired. Like whenever you knock one out and chase him around for a little bit, he'll have a little animation of him becoming tired and out of breath, giving you a chance to catch up and smack him with that sword. So I suppose, the more I think about this enemy, the more interesting it actually becomes. In theory, they could have maximum health if you never hit them the second time. So I'm going to go ahead and put them up here in... I'm conflicted. I'm so conflicted. Okay, I decided to place them into B tier. Their gimmick is a little less interesting than the Business Scrub, but just bear in mind that's a very high B tier. So actually, let's go ahead and if it matters, we'll go ahead and put them here. Within the ranks, they don't necessarily matter, but except for the ones that I specifically note to matter. Okay, next up is the Club Moblin, one of the most nostalgic enemies for this game for me, personally, and one of the first enemies that you'll actually find as an adult leading up to the Forest Temple, so that's definitely going to help it out. They're completely immobile, and they will not turn around to look at you even though you're behind you, so they're pretty dumb. If you don't kind of know the trick to get past them, they can be a bit challenging, and they're basically the gatekeepers to the Forest Temple. So with that in mind, and the fact that, they look pretty cool, honestly. They do take 2 hits from the Master Sword, so they're kind of tough, even if you're hitting them in the back. I'm going to go ahead and slap them into a B tier, and that will be that. Speaking of which, I'm going to go out of order and pull out the Spear Moblin. Now, the Spear Moblin is annoying. I don't like the Spear Moblin, never have. However, they are significantly weaker than the other ones, although they do have the gimmick that they are immune to damage from the front, basically guarding while they do their charge attacks, which makes them pretty dangerous, honestly. You know, they knock you back, they undo your progress. If you're not thinking about it, they can really best you, which is kind of a big deal. This is actually used as a reason for one of the parts of a tutorial as far as, like corner peeking with Z targeting. So that's a little bit interesting as well. I'm going to go and slap it into A tier. In my opinion, not quite as nostalgic as the Club Moblin, but as far as importance in the game, it is very important. So getting back in track here, we're going to talk about the Dodongos, and the Dodongos are an interesting enemy. I like Dodongo's Cavern. It's probably one of the more nostalgic levels for me, in my opinion. Granted, the amount of times that I've played it has been very, very high, so there's that. Now, these enemies have an interesting concept that has basically been carried through all of the Zelda games. If you feed them a bomb, they die. That's just that. However, these guys actually have a counterattack. Am I thinking of Majora's Mask or am I thinking of this game? I'll go ahead and disregard that for the placement, but at least I know for a fact in Majora's Mask, if you hit them in the tail, they do a little spin attack as a counterattack, which is pretty interesting. But disregarding that, because I can't remember if that's Ocarina of Time or not, they are a long-running enemy. Overall, I think they look pretty cool. It is interesting that their weak point is their tail. Usually you'd think, beat them about the face. Usually with enemies in this game, you just kind of have to hit them wherever, so any kind of defensiveness is pretty interesting in my opinion. So I'm going to go ahead and slap them into the B tier, just for the fact that they do have some very natural armor, which is quite nice. And in the interest of logic, we'll go ahead and talk about the baby Dodongo. The fact that they blow up and they have kind of like this kamikaze attack is rather interesting to me. So if order was important, I would put that above the standard Dodongo. They don't breathe fire, but still they come out in groups and they can be a little bit challenging to deal with. They have the interesting aspect of exploding even after death, so you still gotta worry about them, whereas most other enemies, I guess the standard Dodongos explode too, don't they? I'm gonna go ahead and put them down here. If order even mattered, I'm gonna go ahead and put him down here below the standard Dodongo. Next, let's go a bit out of line to the standard, what is this thing even called? It's called a white bubble. I don't even remember them, honestly. I remember the green, the blue, and the red bubble. I do not remember this bubble. Apparently they exist, but it's just a worse version of the other two bubbles, so why does it's unimportant. It's a totally unimportant enemy. Moving forward, so while we are talking about bubbles, let's go ahead and pull the red bubble here. Now, I would say the fact that the red bubble can light you on fire, and I do happen to enjoy the area that the red bubble is in a little bit more, does do damage over time, so I'm gonna go ahead and slap the red bubble right next to the blue bubble. Maybe, let's go one lower, that way, if order matters, and in the interest of continuity, let's go ahead and throw the green bubble up here as well. Now, the green bubble actually has some size differentials that can happen with it. It can be rather large or it can be rather small, depending on where it is. However, they always seem to patrol the exact same area, so a little less interesting in my mind, whereas the red and the blue bubbles are a bit more dynamic. They actually attack you aggressively. All factors, I'm going to slap it into C tier. So I'm going to go ahead and throw this man up here, and we're going to talk about Sharp. Now, Sharp is a very unique enemy, not much different than a standard Poe. However, he does have a large amount of lore attached to him, and that lore really does make a character for me. And the fact that his name is essentially tied to music is very interesting to me. He is one of the two composer brothers, so very interesting in my opinion. Let's go ahead and slap him into A tier. So next, we're going to talk about Flat. So I'm going to put Flat right next to Sharp, however, a little bit in front, just because I do tend to prefer kind of his aesthetic, minor scales, minor feelings to music a little bit more. Anyway, so a bit of personal preference. However, these two do have a bit of an interesting backstory. They actually gave up their lives to protect the song that they had both created together from getting into Ganondorf's hands. So they essentially let themselves die and sacrifice themselves so that Ganondorf couldn't have the Sun Song. Pretty interesting, pretty noble. Definitely gonna slap them both into the A tier. In fact, you know, you could honestly go your entire playthrough and never find these guys. So I'm going to slap them up to A tier, right up there with the like. They're probably not going to have a good time up there. But anyway, yeah, with the lore, and they're an uncommon enemy. They're an exceedingly rare enemy. There's only one of each of them, and they are a very, well, rather important part. They actually give you one of their items, well, backhandedly. They don't actually give it to you, but you know what I mean. Anywho's, it's what next? We have the Floor Master. Now, the Floor Master, my man, is actually a very interesting enemy. I rather like it, but I absolutely detest it. I hate it. And while they're not very difficult to deal with once you know what you're doing, they do split into 3 smaller Floor Masters, which can then suck the life out of you and turn into more Floor Masters, which is spooky in and of itself. So I'm gonna go and slap them into A tier, A or S, let's go with A tier. S tier is only reserved for the extra special enemies. And for the interest of continuity, let's go ahead and look at the Wall Master. Now the Wall Master, I hate the Wall Master. I think they're much less difficult to fight than the Floor Master, although they can catch you out, but if you know what you're dealing with and how to deal with them, they're absolutely easy. Their whole mechanic is just to inconvenience you and move you back to the beginning of the level. They don't really damage you that much, if at all. I honestly don't remember, because I don't think I've ever been caught by one. Navi blatantly tells you, hey, you're about to get messed up if you let this happen. And if you do let that happen, it's your own fault. So it's basically a newbie trap. They have been in the game for quite some time, so they are an iconic enemy. That's going to keep them above C tier, but that's about it in my opinion. Their whole shtick is just to inconvenience you. That's it. They just take you back to the beginning of the level, which is very frustrating in my opinion. Next we have the Gerudo Guard. Now I'm going to go ahead and lump both the Gerudo Guard and the Scimitar Wielding Guards into one. It won't change their placement on the tier list very much. I do find it kind of interesting that the guards are one of the few enemies that Link won't challenge. I don't understand why he doesn't challenge the guards with the glaives or the pole arms or the spears or whatever you want to call them. I don't understand why he doesn't do that. He totally could, and I would even make a good case to say that with the Deku Nuts, he could probably take on a handful of these enemies at once. Now the scimitar wielding Gerudo, he doesn't really seem to mind. However, they do have the unique quality of being able to put you to sleep. So basically at that point, your health pool isn't the problem. They're almost never going to do enough damage to actually kill you, but they can put you to sleep and put you back into the prison. So, a very interesting concept of enemies, and one that definitely does need to be respected. An error could cost you a lot of time in the Gerudo area, so I'm going to go and put them into A tier. Okay, here we have a Goma Larva. I mean, they're weird looking, they're icky. I'm going to be honest with you, I knew about them. I don't think I fought one of these enemies specifically since like the first time that I played the game. They're super easy to deal with. It's very easy to make Goma not even spawn them, so they're totally a non-issue. They're a support enemy, they're a minion, they're D tier garbage. They are somewhat interesting in the fact that they are spawned by another enemy, but other than that, that's about that. Ah, yes, the Gold Skull Chola actually has a quest associated with it, so I'm thinking we're probably going to slap it into the A tier here. Reason being, they are rather important for some pretty useful upgrades into the game, and if you're playing the randomizer, well, then they're vital. To be completely honest with you, you have to get them. I always thought it was fun to, whenever you eliminate the enemy, grab the token and do some, in some fun way, like do a backflip or something when you get it off the boomerang. So it is that little bit of interactivity that you do have with it, and it's a collectible. They're not terribly uncommon, but they're hidden relatively well, and it's a game mechanic enemy, and I really appreciate that. So A tier it is. All right, here we have the Keese. Now, the Keese is interesting because the base Keese, rather, can turn into an Ice Keese or a Fire Keese, depending on how suicidal it's feeling at the moment and what elements are around. That's interesting as far as the concept is. However, until it becomes the Ice or the Fire Keese, it's just a standard enemy like the Gwai, pretty easy to deal with. Let's move on over to the Fire Keese. I'm going to go ahead and put it next to the Ice Keese here. Again, not necessarily in any order, but it would make sense these two enemies would be close together. They do the damage over time, but I'm going to put it in front because they do the damage over time and they can burn up your shield, which can be very frustrating, but if you have a wooden shield, then what are you doing with a wooden shield around these enemies anyway? You should know better. And one of the advantages that this enemies does have over the ice keys, it doesn't do that annoying freezing thing, which honestly might be worth a tier, but I'm going to go ahead and just put it slightly above. Next we have the lever. I'm pretty sure there's only one place this enemy actually is. They're not terribly interesting. They usually just kind of try to surround Link and then they run at you in a straight line. They're a nuisance, basically. They're a nuisance that's meant to inconvenience you and make you not take your hand off the controller. Basically, they just keep you from getting a drink or eating some chips while you're walking up to the Spirit Temple. That's basically all that they do. I mean, their design is a little bit creepy, and it's interesting that they attack in packs. There can be the large one, which I think might be just the variation. No, you know what? It's not worth that. They're literally just an inconvenience enemy, and they're totally uninteresting. They come up out of the ground, and they move in a straight line. They don't even track you very well. They basically go in a straight line. Pretty boring enemy. F tier. Trash. Here we have the Freezer, only in one place, maybe two. I believe there's two areas where this guy can spawn. Overall, he does the annoying freezing thing. They're kind of interesting in that they can move around, they can actually become invisible, so that is an interesting mechanic if nothing else. The freezing mechanic's kind of annoying. Really, the only way this enemy is going to be a problem is if they catch you out, which they can do because they can turn invisible. So, mid-C tier. The Gibdo. Well, my boy, I think we both know where this enemy is going. And here's why. This is a Redead, but better. Now this can actually turn into a Redead should you use a fire attack on them. They still have that amazing, amazing, terrifying screech that we've all grown to hate and haunts our nightmares even as adults today. Honestly, I would say if you think of Ocarina of Time, if someone asks you what your least favorite or most scarring enemy is, it's probably going to be the Gibdo and the Redead, which is why I'll be placing them both in the tier. Not only are these enemies total tanks, they literally have the ability to control the fabric of time. It's insane. They can freeze you in mid-air, mid-jump slash. Now in later games that was actually taken away and they kind of put you in a stun, like you stun backwards and you hit the ground, but in this game they can catch you no matter where you are. They're formidable opponents, and if you don't respect them, they will absolutely chew the hell out of you. Not to mention all of the lore that can go into both of these enemies is insane, which if you haven't seen my Redeads are clay theory, then it's pretty interesting and it does go into some of those topics, so check that out if you'd like. Either way, just take my word for it. There's a lot of theory potential for these enemies. They're super dark. I really, really enjoy, kind of that extra dark subject material that they went with. They look horrifying. They're an amazing enemy. I hate them for all the right reasons. Up next we have the Shell Blade, only found in one, maybe two locations. I'm pretty sure you only find it in the Water Temple, even if you do find it in another location. They're not terribly interesting. They do have very great defensive capabilities, and honestly, this could be a very annoying enemy, but really all it comes down to is block, aim with the hook shot, eliminate. Now, if you do get surrounded by them, they can be pretty challenging, so overall, they're a gross enemy, and they do bleed. They actually share that with the spikes in that they do have red bubbles that come out, so they bleed, which is an interesting and unique mechanic. Ergo, C tier. So before we get into Amy, the green post sister, I'm actually going to place the other two first, and reason being, these two poses are basically a tutorial, so that's going to move them up into how to use the bow and how to use the bow at range. When you enter the area, you see the four post sisters, one of which is considered a mini boss and will not be on this list, but you see, which one is this? Joelle's the first one that you come up on, the red post sister that we have here. You actually can't do anything about her, so it's actually kind of interesting. She's able to mock you on the way by, but you can do nothing about it. And you have to remember to go back and deal with her. So, overall, for the BM, I'm gonna say it's a tutorial enemy, but the fight itself is basically just a standard Poe fight, which is made very trivial with the Deku Nuts. So I'm gonna go ahead and slap him into B tier. I like blue more, however, B tier as well. Now, here's where the difference is made. Amy. the green sister, is basically the same as the others, but with a bit of a twist, and that's going to go ahead and put her into A tier. Now, if you're familiar with the game, you know that you have to shoot her painting and then do a small block puzzle, which isn't exactly the most fun thing to do, as pushing in that game is rather painful, to be completely honest, super slow. But just the fact that there is a different kind of mechanic in play there, and the arena is actually a bit more favorable to fight in, does make her, in my opinion, a better enemy. So here we have the Anubis Statue, and I really want to rate this enemy highly, but it's strange. This is a very, in my opinion, polarizing enemy. You only see maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 of these enemies tops in one single area of the entire game. And their whole shtick is that in one of the rooms they do have the interesting mechanic of doing exactly what you do, but in reverse. So the idea is that if you don't have any fire arrows, you can actually get to the opposite side of the room, shoot a switch or push down a switch, I don't remember exactly which one it is, and destroy the enemy that way, allowing you to progress through the temple. So it's pretty interesting. Actually, I think it's Din's Fire, because I think that happens in the childhood area of the Spirit Temple. So it's interesting in that way. They do breathe fire, but they don't always seem to breathe fire. They're a bit unpredictable in that manner. So that's going to keep them at a D tier. Otherwise, they're interesting, but meh. I want to rate them higher, but I know for a fact that would be biased. Here we have another enemy that spans both the adult and child timelines. The Armos is, while an interesting enemy, rather easy to deal with. At least in Ocarina of Time, you can use your sword on it. So in later games like the Wind Waker, it was made more interesting because you had to use a bomb on it. You had to hit it in the back, use a bomb, depending on which variant you were fighting. But in this game, very easy to deal with. They are masters of disguise, which is what's keeping them out of the D tier. And the fact that they explode does make them a bit more interesting, so you have to be leery of that. So overall, solid C tier enemy. Now I'm going to go a bit out of order yet again and go to the Standard Poe. Now Standard Poe is pointless. It's literally pointless to fight a Poe unless it's bothering you. Now, there is a bit of lore attached to these Poes, which is kind of why I'm going to go ahead and slap it into the D tier. They're basically the spirits of dead people. And when you think of things like that, you usually find them in graveyards, and it's relatively interesting. However, that's where you'd expect to find them. You'd expect to find spirits in a graveyard. Not terribly interesting. Unlike the Big Poe, which is usually found in Hyrule Field. Now, this is rather interesting in my opinion, and actually is going to bump it up to a B tier enemy, because you have to shoot it while you're on the back of the horse. Well, maybe you don't have to be on the back of your horse, but you do have to shoot it with an arrow. They actively try to avoid you. They won't let you hit them with the sword. And the fact that they're in Hyrule Field kind of lends some credence to the Great Hyrulean Civil War. Probably this is, an enemy soldier, or someone who died out on the battlefield, or perhaps a bandit, some spirit that died before their time, before they were ready to die. So, infinitely more interesting than the Standard Poe. They're also useful. You can give their spirits away for these Standard Poe spirits. If you use their spirit, they literally damage you. I mean, this one damages you too, but there's still something you can do with it. Also, I think it's funny that you have the ability to capture it or let it go away, and then it just BM laughs at you. I think that's super funny. So, a solid B tier. So we're going to go a bit out of order again to the Lizalfos. Lizalfos is actually a very, very nice enemy in my opinion. I really enjoy fighting them. I know that, there's definitely, once you get their patterns down, they're super simple, but it's one of the few times in the Ocarina of Time when you feel like you're actually having a duel with someone. They totally have the Jackie Chan syndrome in the fact that they don't actually both attack you at once, even though they usually do ambush you in groups of 2, but still, the fact that it feels like a duel is pretty interesting in my opinion. Next we have the Dino Floss, basically just a Lizalfos, but a little bit better, so I'm going to place it above them on the tier list for the exact same reasons as before. It's a relatively cool fight, and a lot of times when people do mods of Ocarina of Time, they'll opt to use that enemy in place of the Lizalfos. Finally, let's get on to the Octorok. Now, the Octorok is another one of those annoyance enemies. With the controls on the Nintendo 64, it's rather difficult to actually aim up and hit one of these enemies before they hit you, and I honestly just think they're trashed here. They're nothing but an annoyance enemy. Most of the time when you defeat them, you can't gather the items from them anyway, and honestly, I just hate them. F tier. Boom. Next we have Skull Kid. Now Skull Kid is a rather interesting enemy in the fact that he doesn't really have to be an enemy. You could go the entire game and just never even really encounter him as an enemy depending on how you play. They did expand on his character in later games, which is relatively interesting. However, the fight's not terribly difficult. You just kinda... I'm gonna be honest, I don't think I've ever actually killed him. I never really felt the need to. I guess that says something about me. Anyway, an enemy that's kinda not really an enemy. He just hates you because you're an adult. So I'm gonna go ahead and throw him into the D tier. I usually just avoid him, to be completely honest. Speaking of very, very meh enemies, we have the Torch Slug. The only interesting thing about this slug is that it's definitely unique looking, which is gonna keep it out of the F tier. That's about it. It is kind of a pain to fight because you have to hit it, knock the fire off of it, and then it goes gray and runs away. Now, I suppose you could flip it over with a hammer, but that could require you to change items, whereas the sword's always out, so why not just hit it? But overall, relatively uninteresting enemy, Peahat Larvae. Now, this is an enemy that may as well not even be an enemy if we're being totally honest. They're interesting in the fact that they're spawned from a different enemy, which I'm really rather interested in, but we'll get to that one next. The larvae just kind of chase you down. They do home in on you a bit if I remember correctly, but overall, they're just kind of meh. You just kind of deal with them. It is fun that they have kind of a toppling animation. They can only actually fly for so long. Once they run into something, they will die. Or if they just fly for long enough, they actually do woo and kind of die. So that's a little interesting as well. And now we have the Peahat. The standard Peahat, the spawner of the Peahat larvae, naturally. Now this is a much more interesting enemy, and one that I actually don't fight very often. So you're coming out of Kakariko Forest. The worst thing that you've dealt with that wasn't a boss at this point is some plant, basically. What's really gonna happen on your adventure? However, if you look directly to your left after talking to some annoying owl, you're gonna see this thing. The top of it doesn't look so bad, and then it emerges from the ground, and you go, ah tier it is. It's massive. The only time you can fight them is as a child, so you can't even have access to a lot of your adult weapons. It should also be noted that if you do happen to stun this thing, its weak point goes under the ground, so it basically has stun protection, which is very, very interesting. Not to mention, it spawns its larvae to come attack you. It's just a big old helicopter blade of just stay out of my face, kid. And it's amazing. Next we have the standard Skull Chola. Relatively uninteresting enemy, just a smaller version. I'm gonna go ahead and put it into let's go with the C tier, and it'll make sense once we talk about the Skull Wall Chola. At least this one has the interesting aspect in that it will charge after you if you're on the wall, which is a bit terrifying. Honestly, I did not know this when I was younger. I thought you just had to avoid its gaze altogether, but if you are not moving, it does not see you. So there's a little bit of an interesting kind of counterplay there. However, most of the time you can just pick them off the wall to begin with. And as far as Ocarina of Time goes, this again is another one of the first enemies that you'll find in the Great Deku Tree. So nostalgia is definitely working for it as well. The Stall Child. Now, the Stall Child is a very interesting one in my opinion. As with some of the other things that we've talked about on this list, I have had some theories about this enemy, and one of those theories is actually that this enemy may be, the soldiers that died during the Hyrulean Civil War to kind of complement the Big Poe down here. I think, honestly, what's holding this enemy back from being... I'm gonna go and put it in B tier, and here's why. What's holding it back from being A tier is not necessarily the enemy itself, however, the conditions that you have to fight the enemy in. The gates to Hyrule Castle do close up at night, which can be very frustrating, and you're just left to wait there, and I guess these guys give you something to do, and they can be a decent way to make money early on, but still, it's just annoying. It's just frustrating to be almost at the gates and then have it close on you. And then you just have to deal with these guys. These guys are the reason that you can't go get your bag of chips and still have nighttime pass. So for that, interesting lore, relatively boring enemy design. They do attack in groups of 2, so that's also, they seem to have some team strats. A good way to make money, but otherwise, yeah, just bothersome. Now, I don't think anyone is going to be upset with me placing the Stalfos high up on the list. This is a very interesting enemy. Some encounters with them are a bit different. I'm going to place them in S tier because if you think of adult timeline Ocarina of Time, I tend to think of the Stalfos and the fact that they can actually regenerate themselves should you not eliminate them fast enough. A very interesting concept, which makes you not necessarily tunnel one enemy and then just kind of be done with that one, move on to the next one, which is how you would logically fight most battles. You have to kind of whittle them both down and then eliminate them at relatively the same time. They have very good blocking potential. There are only a handful of frames in which they are actually open, unless of course you're counterattacking, in which case that's, a little bit different. They react more to your actions than most enemies, making them more interesting to fight. And just as with the Gerudo and the Lizalfos combo down there, it's one of the few times you feel like you're actually having a sword fight. So it's a really cool fight and I really like them. Ergo, S tier. The Wolfos. Now the Wolfos is, let's be honest, it's not a great enemy. I love the little wolfy boy, okay? He's great, he's fine, but man, they're easy. Literally, Navi tells you their weak spot is their tail. You just do that and then hit him. Easy. That is like easy mode incarnate. There really are no surprises with them. The animations that they have where they can backflip is pretty cool. And a lot of this does go with the White Wolfos as well. However, I will be placing them just a smidge higher just because they're more interesting. I just like the idea of a white wolf a lot more. It's basically personal preference. I think I read that they're maybe a little bit tougher, but honestly, if you're going for the tail, if you're doing the backflip jump / combo, it doesn't matter which one you're fighting. They're both eliminated. And here we have the definitive Ocarina of Time enemy tier list. What would you change about this tier list? Let me know. Mostly just what would be your top 3 or top 4 top tier, top of the line S tier enemies, or your enemies. What were some of the enemies that make you go I also do theories and gameplays. You're welcome to check out the theory playlist or the other Zelda content that I have, or check out the gameplay channel. We're playing through the Ocarina of Time randomizer at the moment. Having a great time over there. And with that, I am Newbornkilik, and I will see you in the next one. I'm out.